Hello everyone, welcome back to 2020 Broto Art, Climate and Science Conference. This is our session number 5, which is about cathedral thinking. My name is Ian Edwards and I produce this conference, our 3rd annual conference. I'm here at Pilgrim Monument, a granite tower of almost 253 feet, built between 1907 and 1910. It's not a cathedral, but it's a project that took vision and ingenuity and creativity. And cathedral thinking is ages old. Cathedral thinkers would start projects that they would never hope to see finished. And so what is climate crisis? What is the climate crisis if not a cathedral project? With our legacy being the viable future for generations to come. Our guest, Rick Antonson, is an author and a public speaker. He's really embraced cathedral thinking as a way of looking at the world and our place in it. And if art and science have a role to play in making time relevant in our climate decisions today, we might find inspiration in focusing on projects that take lifetimes to fulfill and communities of people to work on those legacies. Special thanks to our sponsors, including the Provincetown Tourism Fund and Economic Development Committee. Broto is a nonprofit organization, and we are gratefully accepting donations if you would like to support us. The first part of the session is pre-recorded, but we will be live for a Q&A right after. So write your questions in the Q&A chat box, and please check out some of our other sessions. Now let's talk cathedral thinking. So hello everyone, welcome to Broto Art, Science, Climate and Science. This is our 3rd annual conference of collaborating artists and scientists working with climate change. Our theme this year is Deep Time, and we have a whole program around how time is more or less, or is very relevant to climate change. So when we're talking about long time, we're talking about hundreds of years or thousands of years. And in some ways, we're talking about cathedral thinking. And that's the theme and the topic of today's session with Rick Antonson, author and public speaker, and cathedral thinking. So I wanted to say thank you and welcome, Rick. How are you doing?
Very, very pleased to be a part of this. It's a proud occasion, I think, to have this become the type of conference it's evolved into, and how it's going to be shared by many more people this year because of the circumstances. So thanks for having me as a part of it.
Well, and we're thrilled to have you. So let's just start with how you found out about cathedral thinking. What is it, and how did you find out about it?
Well, it actually more currently came to me a few years ago when my wife Janice was working in Scotland, and Christmas Eve we went out to St. Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh, and it was a big building. It's got, the tallest ceilings and the big pillars, and there may be another 1,000 people there. It was a interfaith, sort of non-denominational evening, and it was just really special. And you can't help but be in awe of the physical structure. And afterwards, when we were walking, going to have a glass of wine, we got talking about the people that built that. And it reminded me of a term I'd heard decades ago, cathedral thinking. And the sort of the Reader's Digest description of cathedral thinking is that if you were an architect in the 1400s, and the people in your village or your town or your city came and said, would you design a new cathedral? You'd begin that process knowing that you would not live to see it completed. It may be your grandson or the granddaughter of a neighbor or a partner that would eventually complete the final designs. So you would begin knowing that you had to do a really fine job, but that someone of a few generations down the road with new tools and perhaps ability or techniques that you yourself did not possess would be finishing the project. So you better do your job right, but with a long-term view.
So when we're thinking of cathedral, what are examples of cathedral thinking that people might know?
Well, the term cathedral thinking, which has been around for 100, 200, however many years, and I had nothing to do with its genesis. I'm simply become one of the apostles for the concept. And I've come across it being used in Australia, say, for the the interest of having and the mandate of having good, pure water sources for generations, 3, 4, 5 decades from now, 20 decades from now. That if it's not done properly now, that option to do something in 20 years and start then will be gone. I've heard the term cathedral thinking applied to land conservation in Scotland, where they've said, look, we've got these lands now that can be contained, and we can have them so that our great grandchildren will have them. If we wait another 20 years to start, it will be too late, and those options will have gone. But I think also, Steve Jobs once said that you can never see the dots connecting looking forward, but you can see how they connect when you look back. And he had many examples. But one that I would use for cathedral thinking would be perhaps the civil rights movement in the United States, or perhaps internationally, the women's movement, which was begun by people generations ago. And they went fits and starts, and they laid foundation blocks upon which future generations could build. And with the achievements of today, which are only partway through the construct of those movements, but they look in hindsight like they benefited from visionaries that said, I will start. I will build a strong foundation upon which my children or children of people I care about or people who care about the cause will build and improve. And so I think those are meaningful examples. And of course, the environmental movement and climate change are probably the most important that we are faced with now, where we benefit from some cathedral thinking in the past, but we need it now more than ever.
And we're going to get to that. I wanted just to take a little sidestep to the motivation of people who would see a project that they, conceive of a project that they would never see the benefits from, that they would never live to see the benefits of them. And I find that kind of motivation is what we're lacking on the environmental side, which we will get into. But I wondered if in just the generic cathedral thinking mindset, what is it that gets you to do this massive amount of work, knowing that you'll never see it done?
Well, I think there are a few aspects to that. One is which, we live in a Western civilization where the business preoccupation is on quarterly results, and compromises are made because of that fettered view of what success means. And, it's not that long ago, 50, 60 years, when those types of fixations were less than, look, we're going to start building a car and improve it each and every year. We're going to start home construction and learn how to do it better. People thought in terms of, it's the old sign that would be Rick Ansons. They thought, well, someone's going to take over my work, and I want them to be proud, but to be able to do things better and differently. So I think that's an aspect, but I also think that most people feel and maybe are driven or were maybe trained to try and get the job done. And I would say for those who embrace cathedral thinking, we should all be involved in unfinished work. We should do our part. But one of the best descriptions of the working on the cathedral was the people who put in place, say, the foundation block or the cornerstone. Because what they knew is that it would be others who would build upon their work. So they couldn't scrimp and just do a temporary foundation block. They had to have the best foundation block they could put their hands on. Right. And when they were building cathedrals, in the early days, they did not know how to do the arches. They did not know how to put that wedge stone in place. And they would try to do a curved arch, and it would collapse. They tried to put beams in, but beams would age and rot. So eventually they had the technology, but it wasn't the first stonemasons that knew how to do that. It was in the future.
It's the foresight of all these visionaries that I find really so appealing, that they should have to build a foundation for a building that they don't really know yet how to build. And that seems to be an antique idea when we look at today's, short-term outcomes and need to benefit us in this time. And let's think about climate when we think about the kind of foundational aspects we should be building today for an uncertain future. I mean, is there a way for us to extrapolate from cathedral thinking of cathedrals to climate building of climate?
Well, it seems that the first thing any cathedral thinker has to absorb, however they're applying it, so to apply it for environment, is that the realization that the job's bigger than you, it's bigger than me, and in fact, it's bigger than our living right now. So cathedral thinking is the one way to keep the living generation tethered to the future. And if you look at something and say, that job will not be done in a deadline, it's not going to happen by 2030 or 2033 or whatever, it's going to take longer. So you begin to realize that you have a, not just an obligation, but a responsibility to start it, to do it now, to realize that it's but nudging it down the road. And the activist Greta Thunberg has said to the European leadership that, in the Parliament and to the British media and others, that the only way to solve climate change is to apply cathedral thinking. That's the way to address the issues. And we've got a website, the not-for-profit website, cathedralthinking.com, and every time she's quoted in a magazine doing that, we see a spike in the hits because people want to find out how to be a cathedral thinker.
Well, we should plug your website again. That's cathedralthinking.com for our
Correct.
audience, and I invite you to go and check it out. That will give you some more background on what we're talking about today. The idea that Greta should be thinking about future generations and trying to encourage people who are in power to think for her generation, that is very much an example of someone trying to build a foundation when we don't know what the roof is going to look like. What else do we see that could be helpful in understanding what it means to be a cathedral thinker in today's society?
I think, because we find ourselves recording this in the midst of a virus that people were not prepared for, in large part because they would not set aside the funding and the thinking that was based in science that said not what if, but when. And because people thought, well, we can kind of put that into the long grass, we don't have to worry about it now, we've all ended up in a crisis that is almost not able to be managed. And the crisis isn't of our making, but the inability to manage it is because of short-term thinking, trying to trim cost from government budgets. And we're not talking about a lot of money that got trimmed. So some of it got trimmed because of political philosophies. The amount trimmed that could have put the world in pole position very favorably for this, that amount of budget saving, I mean, it's budget dust. It's not significant, but it was saved because people thought too much about, well, I don't need it this year or in my term of elected office, so I won't think down the road. One of the things that I've been involved in this with state or provincial or federal leadership or city councils, to say to them about cathedral thinking and about what they're doing is, because they're all looking at the next election in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, is for elected officials, think beyond their mandate, act beyond their tenure. Think beyond their mandate, act beyond their tenure. That's the only way. We were involved in an Olympic bid, and it was very much, it was going to be 14, 15 years down the road. And a lot of the elected officials at various government levels said, that's too far away. I can't really wrap my head around it. They didn't care because it didn't impact them. But cathedral thinkers are not about themselves. They know the maxim that what was isn't, what is won't be. So I got to do something for the what is to make the will be better.
Yeah. You're calling in from Vancouver that had the Olympics in 2010. My hometown, yay. Olympics planning, the whole shebang, that is a kind of an example of cathedral thinking, planning ahead, multifaceted, very complicated matrix of events and people and venues. And a lot of people go into that knowing that that's a long-term gain. where else in so let's talk a little bit about art and science when it comes to this challenge. Do you see a way for, because that's what we're talking about at Broto, is the synthesis of ideas between art and science that could create something else. And when we're looking at cathedral thinking, I believe that we're not leveraging what we can out of art and science in partnership or even on their own to advance the climate crisis issues.
One of the difficulties for art and science is that it's so hard sometimes to see. So you need to find a relevant sort of physical presence of the accomplishment of art or the accomplishment of science. And one actually could be Notre Dame Cathedral.
Right.
It's the sort of the epitome of artistic art, or about sculpturing, or about people meeting a moment of time in time, and yet it for 100 years, 200 years, it has this beauty. Yet the construction is based on science, the design elements, the leveraging, the engineering, based on science. And it's interesting. It also kind of fits with the times we're finding ourselves in. When it caught fire, the first thing of showing up in an emergency situation is to try and stabilize the situation and do limited harm. So put out the fire. And once they put out the fire, they then needed a new common vision around which people could gather, rally, provide funding, see that it was going to happen, and then begin the new cathedral building around the new cathedral thinking. So that's it in a physical existing structure. But I think the concept can resonate. It's so often, I think, for cathedral thinkers, or in the area of all the climate uncertainty around us, and being kind of overwhelmed by, gosh, what can I do? What can you do? What can Broto do? What can we really do? And sometimes it's important for us to remember it's not what we do that matters, it's what we cause to happen.
What we put in motion.
Yeah.
Right. I suppose if I'm thinking like that architect in a medieval cathedral, and I have a vision for how this thing is going to become a great hall, that I have to set a vision in motion that could generate a kind of fan base or a community of like thinkers that can move this project forward over time, probably past my lifetime. This is why we're talking about this subject today, because in the climate change space that I've worked in, and you see how little momentum there is towards a finished product. What the end game of what sustainability is, or when is climate change fixed, when can we relax. To me, that's a cathedral project right there. Yes. Is that we don't know when that's going to happen. And if we can imagine what a world is made sustainable, then we can build that cathedral. Think maybe 50 years down the road, see where we could be with a vision of a cathedral that is the environment. So I really think that what you're talking about is an inspiration for a lot of people to think big and think long.
Well, and it's hard to see one's own role in something that massive as you describe it, except that you begin to think, my first goal is to do no harm to myself, to my family, to my community. Yet when we proceed as we've been proceeding as societies these recent decades, we are doing self-harm, and we're doing it consciously, we're doing it willingly, we're doing it when there's ample science to say, debate solutions. But as they say, everybody's allowed to their own opinion, but you're not allowed to your own facts. And the facts around what's going on in the climate are pretty compelling. That doesn't mean that they lead to easy solutions or solutions that can be done in my lifetime or your lifetime, but there are solutions. And when people don't even pursue those, or they nudge them off to the side, what we find is at some point you hit a wall that it's too late to try and retrofit the situation. And we're pretty close to hitting that wall when it comes to issues around climate. And, people tried to give us cathedral thinking 20, 30 years ago. People started, look, we need wind power, we need to have solar power. And they knew that would take 30, 40, 50 years to get to commercial viability and wide acceptance. Right. But it's really taken a collapse of petroleum prices to get everybody shaking their head and saying, oh, maybe we're going to need other solutions.
Well, and we're recording this in the middle of a COVID crisis, as you have mentioned, and the whole world is going to be a different place in a few months, and there are opportunities to jumpstart some of these climate issues that have lagged because of a stalemate or hesitation around what the sacrifice will be. And as somebody who's watched long-termism and lamented the fact that we don't think in long terms when it comes to climate, short-term gains is not compatible with sustainability. We could be looking at ways to build in long-term thinking around how we already do that through retirement plans, through insurance programs, through tuition plans for the baby. These are projects that we do every day. We do manage uncertainty very well, but we do manage them in a way that it shows us that we do care about what happens in the future. Climate just doesn't seem to be in that same category.
No, it's not, and maybe it's because while we're surrounded by it more than anything else other than the kind of geography under our collective feet, it's a little hard to look at and see the problem on a daily basis. So people maybe can't come to grips with it the way they need. But I think there are things, and this may be a bit more someone at my age than at your age or some of the others participating, but there does come a time when, like the biological clock that says your body has to do certain things by age 40 or whatever, if you want to be involved in procreation, whatever, there are certain times that are optimum. I think that as the biological clock ticks, as an analogy, I think the legacy clock ticks for a lot of us as well. And you think, many people who are in their 60s or 70s or 80s, they're going to die, and all they're going to leave is checkbook legacy. Somebody gets the money they didn't get around to spending. Big deal. What's the legacy? And the legacy of a Broto conference is far more than leaving some cash
Let's
around,
hope.
Right? The legacy of Cathedral Thinkers is about leaving something somebody else can build on, that whether they stop and think about it or they just do it, it is there. So it's really important that all of us involved in this at this time, and coming out of really uncertain months, that we go forward and we don't waste what we have learned, and we don't wait for another crisis to all of a sudden have public awareness of a whole new set of facts. Nobody on the planet now is absent the facts that the world was unprepared for the COVID crisis. Nobody is unaware that research is complicated and a vaccine can take 12 to 18 months, even when you're throwing buckets of money at it. So right. We can't wait for a climate crisis or another element of climate. I mean, there are lots of crises. We don't need a big one like the pandemic. We don't need right. that for people to all of a sudden learn and say, gosh, this isn't news, 100% expected, like the pandemic was. A climate crush of cataclysmic circumstances is well anticipated, well documented, and counteractions aren't as advanced as they should be. We got to learn from this crisis before that one overwhelms us.
Yeah, if this isn't historically marked as a dress rehearsal for climate change, human-made climate change, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I like that.
We have programming in these sessions that are going to be looking at how we responded to COVID and how we should be using that as a lesson for climate change. Yeah. So, I think this is a dress rehearsal. You mentioned the word legacy. Legacy is what I think we should be all talking about. That's some sort of, when we're looking at choice of words, people understand legacy. They understand that what they leave behind should be important. And I think you're right that we should be of the generation looking at a legacy that is leaving a better place for our future. This is not just lip service. This has to be something that's real.
Well, our generation now, and I'm growing up in the 60s where there was lots of hope. The legacy of the generation that was coming of age in the 1960s is a legacy of more problems than solutions.
Right.
It's a legacy of more hardship. It's a legacy to the next generation of probably living a quality of life that is less, for the first time in many, many generations, less than what the existing generation has been able to enjoy. Hardships financially, massive government debts, all sorts of things that when you think about legacy, that's not what the game's supposed to do. You're supposed to be leaving things like I'm going to mix metaphors, but when you're playing pool, and I love the game of pool. The game of pool is always about the next shot, not the one you're on.
Right.
And our generation has kind of forgotten that, and we're so wrapped up because this is my shot, it's my time, and we kind of forget about the next shot, and that's a shame.
So where has Cathedral thinking taken you in your quest? What have you done with it?
Well, I often have I've said a couple of things when I've had a chance to address a large group, and I've often begun with a quote from Albert Einstein, who said if he had 1 hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes making sure he got the question right. So in light of that, I've given a lot of thought to, what would be my cathedral thought, or how would I try and explain things? And something that strikes me more and more in the last, I identify it right, in the last 12 years, I've become, like a billion other people on the planet, a grandparent. And I have two grandsons, Riley and Declan. I talked to them today on some homeschooling. I'm helping out as a sort of over the screen teaching. And what strikes me is that they will grow up and be able to go from region to region, or state to state, or province to province. They'll have one day their country's passport and be able to see other countries and consistently widen their eyes. And what I get wondering and get heartsick about is, why my grandchildren? Why not everybody's grandchildren? And that has led me, in terms of the long term, in terms of a cathedral thought, is that there are like 216 nations that call this tiny planet their home. And each of us is but one step or two away from someone in every one of those countries. I mean, they could be family, they could be a partner, a friend, they could be someone who attends a conference that we attend. They could be someone we sit down next to in a cafe in the middle of nowhere. And travel is the world's synapses, and travel's a vital force for peace. It more than any other activity brings people together and shares ideas, and importantly, it celebrates our differences. So I think it behooves each of us to consider what we can do, highlighted by the times I'm saying this in, right, what we can do to ensure that one day every leader in the world shares in our belief that the right to assemble and the privilege of safe passage are fundamental freedoms for all people.
It's a great sentiment that we should be living in one planet with one goal. And I suppose the COVID crisis is highlighting a lot of frailty out there, and I hope we have a chance to learn from that. I think that there will be some new big goals set from this experience. I know that our Broto legacy will be that we carry on regardless, and we adapt, and we keep our momentum, and we keep this important conversation going. And for anybody out there listening from art and science background, looking at climate, how they could be working with it, helping us think, innovate, etc., What kind of advice do you have for them for their cathedral project?
Well, I think we know that when crises come calling, we've been found wanting. And yet that just highlights the existing situation. The more fundamental is for anyone in the field of art and of science is, I think, to identify what it is you're doing today, a particular project, a research parameter, the design elements, or creating a piece of work, is that you may not be the one to finish what is nearest and dearest to you. You can be partway through writing a book, but you won't be the person who's maybe going to turn it into a play. You may be someone who's doing short videos that someone else decides should be collected into a thematic approach. So when you're doing something that's got your guts in it, and it is all about trying to perhaps meet a deadline or satisfy a moment where others will appreciate looking at what you're creating, whatever it is, to try and think of the after purposes, to try and think that what you're doing may motivate someone that you have never met, but they're going to see your work or they're going to hear of your science and they're going to build upon that. And they might not know enough to thank you. There are people who have, I think, done absolutely wonderful things that have bettered my life. I have no idea who they are. I don't know who did that, but there's a wonderful saying in Japan in the small towns where they say, when you take a drink of water, stop to thank those who dug the well.
Well, that's a great way to end. I think for anybody out there in the art and science world with a big idea that could go into the next generations, that they should embrace those ideas and use the cathedral architects as their inspiration for thinking along. Thank you, Rick, for what is a really great topic and a great timely topic for us, and certainly a lesson for the world. For anybody who's tuning in, we have 6 other sessions, talking about various aspects of art and science and time. We're working completely 100% online. And if you like this program and you would like to support us going forward, please consider a donation. This is a free program, but we gratefully accept donations. Go to our website, Broto.eco/donate. That's BROTO.eco/donate, and throw us a coffee. And again, thank you very much, Rick. I look forward to talking to you soon again, and best of luck in your long-term thinking and cathedral projects.
Thank you so much for having me as a part of this.
All right.
Be well.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Safe passage.
So just before we get started, I want to invite to the screen Peter Treem, who is an advisor to Broto and is going to just add in his many ideas into this conversation just to keep it that much more lively. And please register your questions with us so we can get to some of your pressing issues. Rick, while Peter is booting up, I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts about this presentation so far, if you wanted to make any additional ideas known.
Well, I think watching a couple of the sessions yesterday was really impressive because, we're talking about something that, and I saw this as one of the side questions that, someone had said, if you don't know what the end is going to be like, is it too long term to begin now? And really the whole bit about cathedral thinking is that if we pick, for example, a goal for 2042, that does seem a long way off. But if you work up the plan, you have to be at a certain stage by 2032 if you're going to be on track for your 2042 goal. Then you back up where you're going to be by 2022, and then you've got work to do tomorrow to start work on that. But one of the sessions yesterday was about the real long term, not something that might be 20, 40, 140 years, but 10,000 years or 1,000 years or a billion years. And it put into a context for me this whole bit that that we're but fleeting, and we either do something to make it better for future generations or ourselves in 10 years or in a year, or we don't. And it seems it's imperative that we act rather than talk. I had a board member once who used to say, talk is cheap, but it takes real money to buy good whiskey. And I didn't understand it at first, but what he was saying was talk, do something. And that's, I think, the motivation for us all. Do something.
There's a number of questions, and I guess Peter's having a challenge getting on. We might just get his audio. But a number of questions have come up in the chat box about how do we get to the right question when we're talking about a cathedral project. Where do we start with the right question to get us to that important project? Hello, Peter.
Hi, sorry about that.
That's okay. Technology.
Camera wasn't working. Whatever.
That's great. Do you have any thoughts about how do we get to the right question? A question asked by Tim.
Are you asking Peter or me?
Are you asking me that one or Rick? Rick, you start and I'll add to your wisdom.
The big question that kind of defines us is who are you? Who are we? Who am I? And I was once told, you are who you are when you're alone in the dark. And I often thought, what are the pressing things when you wake up in the middle of the night, or if you're camping and you're the only one out under the stars, where you feel not just humbled, but intimidated. And so the question begs the answer. What are you doing to become something meaningful? What are you doing to leave something better than just yourself? Is it just about the satisfaction of the next meal, or seeing a good movie, or hugging someone? I mean, life is about a lot more. And so if the question is, who are you? The supplementary question seems to be, what are you going to leave behind? What is it you're doing to leave good, so that it's not about you, it is about all of the others as well.
Yeah.
Peter, is that wisdom to build on, or is that
totally, Rick? No, I think this comes down to the fundamental question of, as you said, like, who are you, and what is the legacy that you want to leave? And this may sound bizarre, but I often think of what do I want people to say at my eulogy about the life that I led? And I honestly think of that often, which is just around, wanting people to be able to reflect on the contributions that I've made in a way that are hopefully positive. And I think about that today. I hope I'm not going to pass away anytime soon. But if I do, I've been very conscious about that. And I think so, I think all of us are in that pursuit of the meaning of life. And why are we here? And what is our contribution going to be? So I think it really comes down to that question. If we all ask ourselves that question, I think we will make different decisions than we sometimes do. And let's also appreciate that we're all full of flaws and that we're not perfect, and we all have hypocrisy, and that's just the human condition.
Sure. Nobody's going to pass the purity test with these kinds of things, but I guess there's a follow-up question about how do we change the language around the climate crisis to include cathedral thinking. It seems like it would be a no-brainer that we should think about legacy and future generations, but building a cathedral out of the environment, is there a language that we can be thinking about?
Well, planning, President Eisenhower, before he was the American president and led forces during the war, one of his learnings that he talked about was that plans are useless, but planning is everything. There's only when you plan that you look at the different scenarios. It's only when you're planning that you're trying to put things in place and finding out that this didn't work. I talked about Steve Jobs earlier. How many times did he fail? How many times did Einstein fail? How many times did Bell fail? These were people who were trying to do something, and they weren't afraid to fail. So when we talk about the impact of climate change and in particular human activity that plays a role in doing that, we've got to find solutions, and they're not evident. it's easy to say, well, if we just did this or stopped that or turned off those taps, somehow everything would be solved. But no, that might in turn create economic dilemmas. So it is about saying we will do something. And we don't have the answers, but if we're trying and we're talking about it, I was told years ago, teach what you want to learn. And I find that when I'm participating in talking about cathedral thinking, people will say to me, did you ever think this? Or why didn't you do this? Or what about that? And I'll say, I never thought about it. So every time I talk about cathedral thinking, I learn more from other people who are looking at it and have thought about that exact concept with different terminology. So I think when we talk about the activities that are harming us from our behavior, willing behavior, and creating crisis dilemma, that we just have to keep on trying to find solutions and doing something today that will make the better tomorrow.
I think also part of what inspired a lot of the folks in the cathedral thinking days was obviously building cathedrals was associated with religion, and there was an afterlife or a promise of a better future or something beyond. And I think people are kind of missing that today. To a large degree, religion is less important in most people's lives than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. And I think I think what's the responsibility on all of us who are trying to awaken people to the climate crisis is to also help build that vision of what the future can look like, so that we inspire people. A lot of what you read about is doom and gloom, and it's about it's the biodiversity crisis. It's the and species extinction and climate change and so on and so on. And people have been admonished for their behaviors. And I think people start to feel under attack. They feel smaller and smaller. They feel more depressed. And I think really part of what we're missing is that grand vision for the future. And I think as policymakers and activists and so on, we need to band together to try and inspire people about a better future, because the one that's in front of us is probably not the ideal one or the optimal one.
Yeah, we mentioned Greta Thunberg in the recorded session, and if there's somebody who's got language or presence that is about cathedral thinking, it's got to be someone like her, who, with very simple messaging, says, just pay attention. And we've had a couple of sessions where paying attention is kind of an underlying theme, and perhaps being prepared to fail is part of the process, and being prepared to think big is what we're trying to do here. And I think there's a lack of that too. So imagination, risk, all these kinds of ideas might be a way to build in some cathedral thinking to our current situation.
I come out of the tourism industry for many, many years. It was sort of my career before becoming a full-time author. And for most people in the tourism industry, their long-range plan is their daytimer. It's not very impressive. And years ago, I met with Council of Forest Industries because there was some competition over land use and places they were going to log and was going to ruin it in terms of habitat for animals, for all sorts of things, including recreation and therefore tourism and guides and outfitters and so forth. And I was embarrassed in the discussion because the person from the forest industry said, "Can you tell me about tourism's long-range plan?" And I couldn't. He then showed me, and I'm not used to giving accolades to the forest industry, but he showed me the forest industry's long-range plan in the province of British Columbia. It was a 100-year plan, and it was articulated, and it was about reforestation. It was about improving harvesting techniques. It was about dealing with public reputation or poor reputation, but it was a 100-year plan. And I, at the time, could not articulate a 5-year plan for the tourism industry. So that drove me to see, where was the airport's long-range plan? And it was a 40-year plan. Where was the Port of Vancouver's long-range plan? It was a 50-year plan. But the tourism industry itself, what had those components, didn't have the long-range plan. When you face the fact that you're not planning for a world that is better in terms of environmental chaos lessened by the year, 2042 or whatever. If you're not thinking that way, then what you do today isn't putting in place something that others can build on so that you see that vision, you achieve that vision.
I would say that I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in. The idea of cathedral thinking is, of course, steeped in religion, and part of the cathedral manifesto, if that's a correct terminology, it would be to recruit people to the church. Images, as somebody's saying in the question and answer, images of hell that would create a movement toward the church for salvation. And isn't there some sort of parallel to the environmental movement to create it as a kind of a church over the long term? I don't know if that's too out there, but it's an interesting idea if we could make a parallel with religion and the environment.
It's a great question for Peter.
The difference is that religion sells you on a future that nobody knows what's really going to happen, right? So they can kind of offer you whatever they want. In this particular case, it's about selling people on a future vision that we'll probably see in our lifetime, or hopefully start to see the beginnings of in our lifetime. So there's a slight difference there. In fact, it brings it more immediate into people's lives. I mean, people make all kinds of decisions based on religion and a hope that somehow that will score them points, in heaven or paradise or wherever it is that they hope to get to. And nobody can prove whether or not that was a good use of time or not until we get there. So in this particular case, I think it's really about bringing it a little bit more forward into people's everyday reality. But I think, one of the participants, Cicely, said, isn't there a way to find something akin to religion in the love of that biodiversity and the species that are threatened with extinction? And, I think part of what our challenge is that people have also become more disconnected from the world around them. I think in some ways the coronavirus situation is in some way connecting people back, because they're having to be connected with their local community. They're seeing some of the improvements that are happening to the environment just by cleaner air, less air pollution, that kind of thing. So maybe there'll be some behavior change that comes out of that.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book about the 1918 pandemic, and it was so informative, particularly when you look at what public policy decisions were made or were not made, how science was ignored, even though it was somewhat more limited in those times than it is now, much more limited, but also that they got through the first wave, and it was by medical journals in the UK and in France declared it had been mild. Yes, hundreds of thousands of people were affected, but they said it was completed, it was over. Within weeks, a revised virus approach emerged and went on to kill an estimated 50 to 100 million people. The crux of it all is that it gave to go back to the religious metaphor, it gave a hellish example of what happened when things were mishandled. But did it turn long-range thinkers into more activism? It did for the short term, but after a while, we softened. So I think, to go back to the reference of a cathedral as a structure for cathedral thinking, we need to keep in mind that while the cathedral had in those days, particularly religious connotations, in terms of cathedral thinking, a cathedral is a gathering place, and it doesn't have to be a structure. It can be a destination. It can be a philosophy. It can be a way to deal with the impact of human behavior towards bad things for the climate. So the notion of a cathedral as a structure is one element, but it's also about gathering ideas and a place where things can come together. And in that way, the environmental movement, as Greta Thunberg has pointed out, needs to adopt long-termism, or the long-term thinking, or the bit about we're building towards something that we can't solve in the next 3 weeks. So there's lots of mixed analogies in there, but I think that the cathedral as a sort of a, whether it's an institution or whether it's a physical structure or it's a mental state, that we're going to try and build something together that will benefit future generations. That's the importance of it all.
I think it's pretty clear that we're talking about metaphor here. I mean, the fact that the environment could be a gathering place for like-minded people to move a big project forward beyond their lifetimes is, unfortunately, I think kind of romantic. And certainly there are people on our Q&A list who are talking about Aboriginal First Nations lore, 7 generations, that this idea of long-term thinking has been around since the cathedrals, and that they have a different purpose in their 7 generations of thought, that they're creating a better world 7 generations out. Does cathedral thinking think that way, or is it just essentially to get to an end?
Well, my understanding of the 7 generations or Indigenous people's thoughts is more limited than I think the questioner would want a response on. But it is another phrasing for the same thing.
Right.
While cathedrals resonate in much of the Western world, they're not something, say, that were prominent in parts of Asia. When people would draw an analogy with a temple, it just didn't have the same long construction period, so it doesn't resonate the same way. But the philosophy of doing things today that will benefit those who aren't yet born is deep within many Indigenous cultures, and we've lost it in the Western world, where it's sort of immediate gratification. Short-termism is the book of lessons that we're taught as being the most important, with self at the forefront of that often. So the multiple generation approach, and it does hit home, as I said in our interview, when you're a grandparent, because all of a sudden you see that there are youngsters that are part of you in a very real way, for whom you're going to leave a mess or leave something better. And I think the saddest is that checkbook legacy bit, that if somebody dies and leaves behind money they've done right, we got to leave back values. We've got to leave behind examples. We've got to leave behind, in the world of art, writings or paintings or illustrations or plays or movies or videos, whatever. The world of art can leave behind examples that portray the values that others can live by, and match that up with science.
I think I think you touched on it, Rick, that this kind of sense of short-termism and instant gratification. I mean, I've been reading a lot about, quite frankly, our ability to achieve some of the goals that you've been articulating, Ian, for the climate and so on, might not be achievable within the current economic system that we have.
Correct.
And maybe that's part of our cathedral thinking project. If we look at the inequalities that continue to just widen. You look at somebody like Jeff Bezos, who's just announced in Canada that he's cutting the $2 an hour premium that people were getting to be working during the COVID crisis, while he's making, unbelievable profits and paying no tax as a corporation. And that drive to keep driving, to keep reporting on those quarterly results, it forces us into a different decision-making model. And I'm not saying that we necessarily have to scrap capitalism, period, but we certainly have to make some significant changes to it, I think, if we're going to achieve the environmental goals or the climate goals that we've been talking about today. So I think that has to be part of our cathedral thinking going forward.
Yeah, we should be real clear. We are leaving a legacy for future generations, and it's pretty easy to see what a lot of it is. Right now, we're leaving them the climate challenges that we've not found a way to address. We are, in the last couple of months in the Western world, leaving behind for future generations the legacy of an insurmountable debt, one that they're not going to be able to deal with in a forthright way that's going to get rid of it. So the behaviors of today will have impact for the great-great-grandchildren of anybody involved in this discussion online, or the three of us, whoever else is there, whether the grandchildren or the next door neighbor. We're leaving a legacy. I'm not sure that the last 2 months have shown us leaving a legacy that we should be proud of, but it will be there. Cathedral thinking is about trying to construct a more positive legacy than the one that happens by giving the back of our hand to proper behaviors.
Well, I want to alert our viewers to the next panel, which is about selling long-termism. You'll get to see Peter again. And it involves some more talk around the relevance of deep time in our current society. To Rick Antonson, I wanted to say a deep appreciation and thank you.
Thank you.
To going in this grand experiment with us as we've gone from in-person to virtual to this very fine conversation. So I'm going to say to Matt that we're going to wrap it up, but any last words?
Well, mine would be that, having originally anticipated being with a group of perhaps 100 people and being able to talk about this and present it live and get the feedback, I've been really impressed that, first of all, you didn't cancel it. Secondly, you figured out a way to make this all happen. And now some 450 or 500 people get to be a part of something that just, I think, evokes hope. And so I tip my non-wearing hat to Broto for not giving up and sticking with this, and short-term solution that will have a long-term legacy, because this conference will be able to be built upon for the greater good for the longer term. So I as one, say thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you to all of the people tuning in. I will leave it at that, and we'll say goodbye from this session and see you at the next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.